Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin our broadcast officially in approximately 2 minutes. Thank you. Good morning again, everybody. My name is John Gonzalez. I'm the Communications Manager at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. I appreciate you all joining us here this morning. I'll be helping to facilitate and moderate today's presentations, and we look forward to the discussion with you. This is a webinar broadcast. It's not a formal meeting broadcast, and so therefore the interaction might be a little bit different than a meeting might be. Throughout the presentations, I will briefly introduce our lead presenter, Frank Greenland, who will then introduce the rest of our presentations today. The way the interaction will work is if you do have questions during the presentation, we will welcome them in one of two ways. You can post using the Q&A link in your Zoom window. That will be a public question that we can respond to with the group. The more common method that you may be more familiar with will be the chat feature. You can chat with the panelists and attendees and post your questions there at any point during the broadcast. We may be able to respond directly to the chat in the context of the conversation, but if you'd like to engage with the formal Q&A method of the chat, we will take those questions and respond to them directly in the conversation following each presentation. So we may not be able to respond to you directly in the middle of the presentation, but we will take them following each presentation with some interaction with you at that time. If you have any questions during the broadcast at all, you can certainly chat with me and I will do my best to respond in the context of the conversation. With that, I look forward to our presentations today, and I will turn it over to Frank Greenland. He is the director of our watershed programs. And Frank, you can take it from here. Thank you. Frank, make sure I'm going to unmute your microphone, sit tight for 1 second, and then you can begin. Thank you.
Okay, we're good to go. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone. We've got a really good attendance on the industrial side of things. We want to talk, we're in the middle of a rate study for our 22 through 26 rates. So today what we wanted to do, I'm going to introduce those that are going to either present or be available for questions today. We'll talk about the purpose of this meeting. I'll give a little overview on the sewer district, who we are and what we do. We'll turn the presentation over to our industrial rate setting consultants to provide an overview of how we establish rates and particularly diving into the industrial rate setting process. At the end, we will take questions. We'll also take any brief questions after my presentation in the middle of today's presentation. So today, I'm Frank Greenland, Director of Watershed Programs for the district. Ken Duplay is here. He's our Chief Financial Officer. Scott Broski, Superintendent of Environmental Services, deals a lot with industrial customers in the work that he does. From Stantec, they are our rate consultants. William Zieberts and Carol Molesky will be tag teaming on their end of the presentation. So here's the purpose of what we want to do today. As I mentioned, we are in the process. Our rates, our 5-year rate setting, the previous 5 years ends in 2021. We update rates on a 5-year cycle. So we are in the middle of a study to assess any necessary changes to the rates, stormwater or wastewater fees from 2022 through 2026. So today what we want to do is sit down with our industrial customers and provide a quick overview of the industrial rate setting process. Today's not going to be the last meeting. We do intend to come back later as we have more details to provide, and we'll have another opportunity for a discussion. And we want to continue to remain in dialogue with our industrial customers. So today's the first effort. There'll be another meeting and other public meetings. So in terms of the sewer district, who we are, what we do, we were created by court order in 1972. So we're actually a political subdivision of the state, Ohio 6119. We're not the city of Cleveland. We're not Cuyahoga County. We provide regional services to Northeast Ohio. So these are those services. The key responsibilities, we own, operate, maintain 3 wastewater treatment plants that serve 1 million residents and treat about 90 billion gallons of sewage annually. We own the interceptor sewers, 330 miles of interceptor sewers. Those are the highways of sewage. All the local communities own, operate, maintain their smaller sewer system. And we have the responsibility for 2 wet weather programs. One is regional stormwater management along the large streams in this area, as well as combined sewer overflow control to deal with that situation. So the 3 treatment plants, easterly, westerly, southerly, they treat sewage from 1 million people, 24/7. We've got a certified lab that monitors those treatment plants for compliance with regulations. We pay for all of the delivery of sewage and treatment of sewage through sewer fees. Project Clean Lake is a large $3 billion program. We're right smack in the middle of it. That program is to deal with overflows from what's called combined sewer systems. These are the oldest systems in Cleveland and the nation. They're called combined because wastewater, stormwater in one pipe. They do overflow in big rain events. That's a problem, and we're dealing with it. Sewer fees are used to pay for that program. The last program is our regional stormwater management program that really began in earnest in 2016, about 44 million annually, to deal with flooding, erosion, and water quality issues along some of the larger streams in our service area. We pay for that program. The revenue, it comes from an impervious surface fee. So this is the shot of the easterly treatment plant on the east side of Cleveland at East 140th. 90 billion gallons treated every year. So that is a lot of wastewater that goes through our plants. To put it in some perspective, 90 billion gallons of wastewater would fill First Energy Stadium 113 times. And Southerly is one of the largest plants in the nation. 280 acres of land surface at Southerly. That's 212 football fields. So it's a very large facility. Project Clean Lake deals with combined sewer overflows. When you mix wastewater and stormwater, there's a whole host of issues. Bacteria being one in the discharge, floatables to the right, more of an aesthetic nuisance. These are the types of things that come out of combined sewer overflow. We're significantly minimizing this issue through Project Clean Lake. This is an example of one of the projects. This is the Doan Valley Tunnel. The primary strategy for dealing with combined sewer overflows is, instead of allowing them to discharge straight to a stream or Lake Erie, drop those flows, those overflows, into tunnels like this one. Store the flow in the tunnel. After the rain event, send the flow from the tunnel to one of our 3 treatment plants for full, complete treatment. These are the general locations of the tunnels. The Euclid Creek and Dugway tunnels are complete and online. That's good news for the Euclid Beach area. The Doan Valley Tunnel is next, and it will be complete in 2021. The Westerly Tunnel is under construction, complete in 2021 as well. Shoreline will start up next year, and the Southerly and Big Creek tunnels are the last of our major projects under Project Clean Lake. I'm going to switch now to Regional Stormwater Management Program. This is the reason why there's a Regional Stormwater Management Program. We have a significant amount of what we call impervious surface. This depicts the impervious surface, the hard surface, rooftops, roadways, parking lots. We've changed the landscape of Northeast Ohio, and it's changed the way stormwater interacts with our stream network. And that interaction creates these types of problems. This is Sam's Club. This is along Big Creek, a very acute location of flooding. And we have other areas across our service area that also exhibit pretty significant flooding. This is an example of some of the fixes that were being done at the local level, and this just isn't going to cut it. You know, guardrails and 55-gallon drums and tires are not going to withstand the impact of erosion along Baldwin Creek. So we're getting in, we've launched the program. We have inspection and maintenance activities and design and construction. This was a pretty acute problem on the towpath trail along the Cuyahoga River. It was encroaching and getting ready to take out the towpath trail and the Ohio Canal. So we got in there and arrested the erosion. This is a picture of the project just after completion. It's been reseeded, reforested. Things are looking great, and this project is really holding up well. So it's an example of the type of work we're going to do under this program. I talked about maintenance. This is a before and after of a culvert. Culverts collect debris. Culvert openings collect debris. Unchecked, this is going to cause flooding and erosion. So this is a before and after shot of one of the culverts in our system, where we inspect, find these types of things, and then write work orders and get contractors to take care of the situation. So shifting to the industrial side of things, the district maintains a database of over 1,500 industrial customers. There's about 150 that are monitored much more rigidly for compliance with federal pretreatment regulations. We monitor all our industrial discharges, the high strength characteristics on some time frame. And we monitor for BOD, TSS, and COD. We establish industrial rates for high strength wastewater based on findings from the sewer district rate study. And this is an industry norm. The district has practiced this for some time, and our rate consultants will go over this in a little more detail. Certain industrial customers do have the option to pre-treat their wastewater to lower the strength of the wastewater to avoid the surcharge, or they can just pay the industrial surcharge. So where we're at right now, we have just begun our rate study to establish the rates from 2022 through 2026. That study is currently in progress. We expect completion of the study by the spring or summer of 2021. Our Board of Trustees will need to authorize the new rates going forward. There will be continued discussion, not only with our industrial customers, but all of our customers. And there'll be different vehicles going forward to continue to provide updates on where we're going with the 2022 through 2026 rates. We've come a long way in Northeast Ohio. This is a shot from, I think, the 50s. The Cuyahoga River burned 13 times. Things didn't get much worse in the 60s. Next shot, yeah. This is a fairly iconic photo of the 1960s. You can see why rivers burn: oil and timber. All you need is a spark and it starts. But things are much better, and we're really proud of our contribution to the rebound of the Cuyahoga River. It's quite a national success story. In my mind, it took a lot of hard work, and it will continue to take a lot of hard work, but these are the types of things we're trying to contribute to in Northeast Ohio. So I think that's it for me. John, are you going to facilitate questions? I don't know if anyone has any questions before we move towards our rate setting process.
Thank you, Frank. There are 3 questions that we have received, so I'll pose them to this group. They may be for you or they may be for another member of the panel. The first question came in, can you please provide a summary of the district's statutory or administrative requirements for customer review, for public review, and for comment on the update and fees starting in 2022? Is there a schedule or a footprint for that input in the rate setting process?
Ask that again. Give me the front end of that again.
Sure. The front end is asking, please provide a summary of the district's statutory or administrative requirements for customer review and comment on the schedule of fees starting in 2022.
Our Board of Trustees represents our customer base. What we will do in terms of statutory requirements, our Board of Trustees has to adopt this rate, these rates, both for stormwater and for wastewater. There will be a very healthy public process in terms of getting out in front of the public to explain not only rate setting, but actually the projected rates for 22 through 26. I don't know, Ken, if you want to add on to that at all.
Yeah, Frank and Scott, feel free to add anything too. Any changes to our code require a 30-day public comment period.
That's right.
So our board would have to vote on the rates to go into that comment period, at which time that would be our administrative requirement to allow those public comments. And then the board couldn't adopt until after 30 days and any comments were received and considered.
Very good. And so the follow-up question to that was, I think, Ken, you may also be best to answer this one as well. What is the schedule for public and customer input into the rate setting process? What does the time frame look like over the next 6 months, 9 months?
The schedule going into next year isn't completely set at this point. As Frank mentioned, we would expect to begin presenting information to the board on these rates in probably early spring, so in the April timeframe. The next time we come back to this group with more information, we'll probably have a more firm schedule.
Question number 3 is the sewer district establishing an industrial customer working group for specific customer information to ensure that the district's, I'm sorry, let me start that one again because I got cut off in the middle of that. Is the sewer district establishing an industrial customer working group for specific Northeast Ohio customer information input to the consultant so that Northeast Ohio specific information is fully considered? Will there be an industrial customer working group for specific input?
We have not to date envisioned an industrial customer working group, but we are always available and open to discussing industrial rate setting with our customers. It's the purpose of today's meeting. We have a long way to go to really understand what changes might occur, not only to the overall rates, but the industrial surcharges as well. We're open to the dialogue. We will be coming back with a much more detailed overview of where we think things might be going. And we're open, I think, to the idea of continuing to have a dialogue with our industrial customers. We would have to determine the best way to do so.
Follow-up question that is also related to that. Is the sewer district expecting specific industrial user input?
We always, want input, and we encourage discussion. There will be another opportunity when we have more details. Right now we don't have the details of 22 through 26, but we will later, into the early part of next year, I believe. We'll have much more details and we'll have a much more detailed discussion, but we're always open to having discussion with our customers.
And the last question we've received so far is the scope of work and the rate study methodology that is being conducted, is that available as a public record? Is that available that we can share with our customers?
I believe so. If anyone wants that, we'd need the contact information. We can provide it.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll continue to take questions as we transition. So we are ready to transition to Frank, is that true?
Yeah. And we're going to turn it over to our rate consultants to get into a much more detailed overview of the rate setting process and the industrial rate setting component.
All right, very good. Thank you, Frank. This is Bill Zieberts. I'll get us kicked off and then Carol Molesky will pick up. Carol, let's go ahead to our first content slide. The comprehensive rate study process is significant, as you've heard. It goes over many months and is a tremendously involved process, but it ultimately is driven by some very simple questions. It needs to be driven by simple questions so that it can achieve the right objectives. One representation of that is here. How much does the district need? From whom should the revenue requirements be recovered? And then how, in a rather specific way, how should the process work? How should we collect those revenue requirements from the appropriate customers? These are simple questions, but tremendous nuance and data and complexity is required and judgment to meaningfully address each of these. The first one seems so simple. Well, how much do you need? You look at the budget, but no, you really don't. A reasonable revenue requirements analysis focuses on a test year concept where we try to come up with, where we try to normalize and look across. Frank mentioned a 5-year process. We want the revenue requirements understanding to be sensible over an extended period to prevent unnecessary oscillation and fluctuations that aren't good for anybody. We also need to recognize that the revenue requirements are driven by policies and targets. You want to do efficient financial management. So we don't want to, people would think, well, we want to minimize debt. Okay, well, that would save money, except not necessarily. We want to do the right amount of debt financing. We want to do the right amount of cash funding. We want to fund things in an appropriate way and reflect all of that judgment inside of the revenue requirements determination to decide then what does need to be required from the rate process. And then from whom is similarly complex. Different customers impose different kinds of requirements, as is obvious to anybody, I think, participating in this call, on a wastewater or a wastewater stormwater system. So with a particular focus on industrial discharges, high strength discharges impose some additional costs. Well, how much? And then how do we get to that? Is by understanding, thinking about the way customers line up, by trying to make customer groupings. We talk about customer classes extensively in our industry. It's just a grouping of customers with some similar characteristics. And then trying to understand and think about how to allocate costs fairly, reflecting the burdens of that class's behavior on the system. Inside the class, intra-class equity, and inter-class, the different allocations that go to different customer classes, between the classes. And then finally, the whole thing has to be driven by the realistic back end. What can the district reasonably bill? How can something be administered? How can it be communicated? So we want to push toward equity and cost recovery. We want to reflect as much as we can reasonably know, but we don't want to lead to some kind of a structure that's going to create excess administrative costs or be something that customers couldn't explain, that would lead to undue concern or disruption. So in every case, it's policy driven. It's got to be very simple on the front end, very simple on the back end. And in the middle, there's rather a significant amount of heavy lifting that goes on. Next slide. A couple, just really quickly, some of the drivers that are facing the district are common to all wastewater, stormwater, and water also utilities around the country and around the world. Ongoing reductions in water use change the dynamic. We lean on the volume of use, volume of water usually being a great proxy for wastewater deliveries, for allocating a significant portion of cost. Well, if the same number of customers is using less water and therefore sending less wastewater, it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it's highly unlikely and almost impossible to think that it would drive your costs down proportionately because of the large proportion of fixed costs inherent to a utility operation. So if we still need to recover the same amount of money, but we have fewer volumetric units, obviously the rate has to change. So there's a change factor that has to be managed. Beneath that's a little graph suggesting affordability concerns. So the little green zone is a consumer price index number, and the blue zone is inside of that consumer price index database. They collect data on water and sewer bills. And nationally, the trend is significantly higher, about 3 times higher over roughly the last decade, indicating that the water and sewer industry, water, wastewater, stormwater too, are being driven by regulations and a whole host of things to change rates at a rather higher pace than inflation. So that's a challenge to rate management. And then finally, the indication on the right is just one of many industry reports documenting and helping water, wastewater, stormwater utilities to come to grips with the massive investment that we've made as a region, as a country, as a city. All of the different utilities have made investments, and then we've got to take care of those assets so that they continue to be available. So we want to do that in a prudent way and not work towards failure and then emergency repairs. So lots of, just a good example of some of the kinds of challenging drivers that every utility has to confront. Slicing up the project, like as we alluded to, financial planning on the top, this cost of service idea, from whom. Right, my screen is cut off. I can't read the task 3. What is it called, Carol? Help me.
It's rate development.
Development, there's the word I can't see. And then affordability. One of the significant challenges, obviously, as rates go up faster than inflation and faster than incomes, is every utility then has to think about the portions of their populations that are struggling to meet their expenses. And then next slide. Just another last mention here of these basic components, and we'll hand it off. The revenue requirement is how much we want to understand revenue generation and expect future revenue needs. The cost of service is the allocation of costs to customers and customer classes in a way that's fair and reflects their use. Developing a rate then is getting to a rate schedule that can actually be billed. It's actually driven by information that the district can reasonably get at a reasonable cost without undue burden, without undue administrative expense. And then this last one, communication. The process needs to be something that can be explained in a forum like this and other forums and managed it in a reasonable way going forward. All right, Carol.
Thank you, Bill. So we've outlined all of the basics of a rate study. And some of you may have participated in a rate study previously in one form or another. I'm going to walk through each of these elements in more detail. So for the first step would be the financial planning step. And this is where we started the rate study a few weeks ago. We are looking at compiling the information on the district's operations and maintenance costs, O&M. As you notice, we use a lot of acronyms, so you'll see a lot of abbreviations coming up. So O&M costs, annual debt service payments for previous investments in infrastructure, current and planned investments in capital improvements for infrastructure. Call that the capital improvement program. Financial policy. So these are the targets the district sets and must meet, typically to comply with bond covenants or its own internal goals and targets for financial management. And then finally, accounts and flows. So we're looking at all of this in total. The financial plan that we prepare is actually a 10-year plan, even though the rate setting process is for 5 years. So from 2022 through 2026, we want to make sure that the district can balance and project its revenue required from all the rates that it collects over a 10-year period so that no surprises come up and that we can anticipate any changes in the future. We try to balance the sources of funds with the uses of funds. So sources of funds primarily include rate revenues. This is revenue from all customers. That includes surcharges from high strength waste. There are other revenues such as interest earnings, not a whole lot these days, but there are interest earnings and other miscellaneous sources. And finally, reserves. The district balances its sources and uses of funds by maintaining a reserve fund, so a capital reserve for those things that are needed for capital infrastructure payments. On the uses of fund side, O&M, again, is operations and maintenance, so those are the day-to-day expenses, annual debt service payments, capital improvements, and meeting reserve targets. Our goal is to balance these groups of revenues and expenses. Currently, we are looking at the current situation, the current financial situation of the district. We look at the projected year-end revenues. And in 2020, so this year, they're projected to be $338 million. For next year, the revenue required to be paid for by rates is $364 million approximately. Out of all of these, the current expenses, current revenue requirements, and the projections from 2021 through 2030, the district is expected to expend $2.1 billion for capital improvements. Now, this is not all cash. Some of it is through loans through the state. So the district has spent a lot of time looking for the lowest cost loans, and the state Ohio Water Development Authority provides some good programs for that in the Water Pollution Control Loan Fund. When we look at an annual revenue required from rates, we can identify the groups of costs. So about a third of the costs are required for operations and maintenance, a third for debt service, and I'm rounding here, and a third for all the capital expenditures. So the district has to use that revenue collected from rates for O&M, debt service, and capital. Once we establish how much is needed, that next step that Bill talked about is what we call the cost of service study. So the cost of service study's goal is to determine how much revenue is needed from each class of customers. We start with the revenue requirements of the system for that test year. We look at how costs are allocated and expended actually across the system. So this is something that we rely on the district's professional judgment, as well as the industry judgment for how a wastewater system works. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. The customer characteristics step looks at all users in the system. We look at all flows flows, and loading characteristics in order to determine how to recover the annual revenue requirements of the system through rates. And as I mentioned, those costs of service by class is the outcome of the cost of service analysis. I'm going to ask Bill to talk us through this graphic, and it's going to take a minute, but it tells us and walks us through this cost allocation process that I mentioned.
So this is a schematic that it just, I think, will give us a moment to illustrate some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of cost allocations. It goes from top to bottom and then left to right. So from top to bottom, that first gray box already has segregated out stormwater related costs. So it's we're focused on the wastewater revenue requirement for the rest of this. And just as an example, we're focusing on wastewater here, of obviously of particular interest to industrial customers. With the wastewater then budget, and budget again is really referring to the revenue requirements for the test year that we've built for this purpose, includes three different large categories, three fundamental activities: treatment related expenses, conveyance, collection, interceptors, conveyance expenses, and then administrative and billing kinds of expenses. Well, let's take off the collectors and billing and focus on treatment. Those then, collection we recover as a function of the volumes of flow that are received, again, generally as reflected by water use. And then billing we associate with customer accounts. And so we can get those in a way a little bit might be simpler. But the treatment part, and what are we doing at the treatment plants? These are some of the classic functional categories that we analyze, and in different studies they sometimes tweak a little bit, but preliminary treatment, primary, secondary, disinfection, solids handling, that kind of moves in a fairly linear way through the plant. And again, different plants use different technologies and might categorize things a little bit differently. They reflect the kinds of activities at a treatment site that are required to get you to the point of discharging effluent that meets the standards, and it handles both on the wet and the solid sides, that winds up taking wastewater that would be deleterious to the environment and turning it into discharges that are beneficial and usable. So understanding the functions then, those from top to bottom, how then would we associate those with customer demands? Well, we do the next allocations then. As you look to the right, those sort of vertical rectangles are emphasizing things that are measurable. And so BOD or COD, that refers to the oxygen demand, TSS, total suspended solids. And those are the two primary and most fundamental cost allocation parameters used in the wastewater business. TP and TN refer to phosphorus and nitrogen. And again, for all of these, there are multiple kinds of measurements. We've used TKN or ammonia, and with BOD and COD and CBOD, and there's multiple specific kinds of measurements, but we're talking here in a general sense about the way that we can try to understand what a customer does that then would drive us to have to invest either in assets or in operating costs, energy and staff, to meet those requirements. So we measure the loadings from the customer class as a whole. We measure or estimate loadings from customers individually or by class, and then we can take the costs and allocate them to customers and come up with unit costs that then support the development of rates and charges. The fundamental questions about this then would be, and we'll continue to illustrate this, what's the magnitude of costs in these vertical columns? How much are we talking about? How much of those costs are driven by something that we can measure? And then are those contributed loadings coming differentially, or are they kind of coming in a pretty normal way from everybody? We're sort of, some of these are, we're all in this together, and some of these are, wow, you guys are really different. And so there's the judgment process that we'll try and use, or that we will use, to allocate costs in an appropriate way.
Thanks, Bill. This next slide actually shows some preliminary allocation results. And we're looking at next year. So this is not part of the rate study projections for 2022 through 2026. However, we use this 2021 estimate for determining that very process that Bill talked about. We've worked with the district staff to determine how does wastewater flow through the system and how do costs get incurred in each section of the system. So what we have are processes or unit processes across the top. We talked about collection and interceptors. TSOs are the costs associated with the combined sewer overflow program. And you have here, starting with pumping, we're talking about what happens in each of the treatment plants. So the pumping of wastewater through the plant, the preliminary treatment, primary treatment, et cetera, all the way through solids handling. So these are all of the processes that happen when your wastewater moves through the treatment plants. And then we have this customer category, which are the administrative type costs. Based on discussions with the district and those industry-based, and I mean the wastewater industry-based approaches and recommendations for how costs are incurred, we've looked at the $364 million budget for 2021 to determine how those costs are allocated in each of the processes. I also like to call them buckets of costs. So we're starting with the top row of buckets, and we've got the dollars. Then, based on each of these processes, a determination is made, and again, using industry documentation and manuals and professional judgment, we look at how those processes are then allocated to the charge parameters of flow, and that's in MCF or 1,000 cubic feet, in BOD and COD, or pounds in this case, in TSS, which is also pounds, and then number of accounts. So since flow is measured in MCF and the amount of pollutants that are coming into the plant is measured in pounds, we just have shown these rows in those terms. The percentages that you see here are the preliminary estimates of how each of the buckets gets allocated to each of these charge parameters. So you'll see that collection, CSO, and pumping are 100% allocated to that flow parameter, meaning that these costs are driven by the flows treated at the plant. The remaining buckets you'll see for the treatment components are allocated partially on flow and then partially through the pollutant loading, so BOD and TSS. So from now on, I'm just going to say BOD. It does include COD as well. I'll say BOD and TSS, and you'll see that there are portions of these buckets that are allocated to those charge parameters. So at the end of the day, the preliminary total out of the $364 million you could see is allocated across those parameters. From a different perspective, we could just look at a pie chart. It's a little bit easier to see the component of the annual costs that are flow related versus BOD, TSS, and customer related. Again, these values are still preliminary. Don't jot them down. We will be providing an update in a few weeks. Once we have that cost allocation process complete, we then move on to customer usage. Customer usage is really important because we look at all of the district's accounts, all build flows and all loadings. It's not just a focus on one particular category. We have to look at it in total. The first thing that we do before we estimate what comes from customers is we look at the flows and loadings that are processed at the plants. So given the measured data at the plants, we know that the flow to the plant, or the volume of wastewater in million gallons per day, or MGD, is approximately 240 million gallons per day. So that is an average over 2018 through 2020. We look at averages to normalize for any unusual circumstances. For TSS, we're looking at pounds per day, and that's just over 255,000 pounds per day. And then CBOD, again, is similar to BOD. So we have 124,000 pounds per day of CBOD. For phosphorus that comes into the plant, it's a little over 5,000. Ammonia is 14,000, almost 15,000 pounds per day. This demonstrates the magnitude of the pollutant loadings. And as Bill mentioned a few minutes ago, TSS and BOD are the primary pollutants that are treated at the plant. We now know that we've got certain characteristics of wastewater flow. So now how do we move on to actually calculating rates? The rate development process looks at different components. And according to the wastewater industry, there are specific approaches that we can use to determine what these rates are. And all of the approaches are cost-based. They're cost-based and they're proportional. So there's some requirements we have to follow to make sure that the charges calculated are proportional to what is coming into the plant. The rates can be characterized by fixed charges, surcharges, and usage charges. Here's another view of that. After we do our cost of service analysis, we have a cost basis for those rates and charges components. The district currently charges a fixed cost recovery fee, volume rates per MCF or per 1,000 cubic feet, and those industrial surcharges. The fixed cost recovery fee recovers billing and collection costs and a portion of administrative costs. So we know that the cost driver is the administrative costs component, and those costs then are recovered through a specific component of the district's rates and charges. I'm going to skip over volume rates for a second, but in surcharges, we look at recovering the cost for treating wastewater that is higher than normal domestic strength. Most of you have probably read the district's titles, and the sewer rate code tells us that all customers pay a certain amount for normal domestic strength up to a limit. So anything greater than a limiting factor or limiting concentration is then assigned a surcharge. And that is because higher strength requires more cost to treat. The volume rates per MCF then recover the remaining revenue requirements. So we take that total revenue requirements, we know what needs to be recovered from the fixed cost recovery fee and what should be recovered from surcharges to get that remaining volume rate. Another way to look at it is the current rate structure and how different costs are recovered. The first column shows the cost components. When we go through that whole cost allocation process, we know that a lot of the costs that the district incurs are fixed. So we're talking about costs that don't vary depending on how much volume of wastewater is treated. As you can imagine, you probably have a lot of fixed costs in your own businesses. And these costs could be salaries. They could be billing customers. They could be customer service type costs, that it doesn't matter how much product or volume you have, you still have those costs. Debt service is another one of those fixed costs. Then we have conveyance costs. So the costs that are associated with picking up the wastewater and taking it to the treatment plants. Then at the treatment plant, we have the costs related to treating and handling flow, BOD, and TSS, which we've talked about. We use the standard process that I've been describing to look at the different rate components and how to recover the costs. The district's fixed cost recovery fee picks up only a portion of the fixed costs. If we recovered all of the fixed costs in that fee, that would be a very large fee because it's based on a per account and a per bill rate. The volume charge then, that the rate per MCF of flow based on water usage picks up the bulk of the costs. And per MCF of billed volume, those cost recovery, that cost recovery component is pretty consistent over time. There are discounts afforded for those customers that have challenges meeting their bills. So homestead and affordability program customers do receive a discount. And then finally, the surcharge component. That is the rate per unit of high strength. So it's milligrams per liter per MCF that is determined to pick up those extra strength, the normal, greater than normal domestic strength costs. This next chart shows the district's current rates and charges. And again, you can find this on the website or in the sewer code. For currently, for year 2020, which hopefully over soon, we have shown the different rates by the different rate components I just described. So the monthly fixed cost recovery charge for a regular customer, so that's one who does not qualify for an affordability program, is $7.95. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're residential, commercial, industrial, you pay $7.95 a month. Then you have the usage rates for the different service areas. So the City of Cleveland customers has one rate and the suburbs pay another rate. That is ending in 2022. So starting in 2022, there won't be a distinction between the two service areas. So we are just showing the current rates here for those two areas. So the usage rate per MCF for a regular customer in Cleveland is $100.15. And then the usage rate in the suburbs is $100.75. You'll see the 2021 rates are presented here also. The industrial part of the code is a little more complicated because of the strength of waste that's involved. And we understand that not all industrial customers pay a surcharge. In fact, the rate formula for industrial usage coming into the plant accounts for normal strength. And if there's a higher strength load, then that is factored into the formula. So how do we do that? Well, we look at a base charge. The base charge plus the normal domestic strength waste is the same. It equals what all other customers pay. So the base charge plus the pollutant cost for normal strength, if we're up to that limit that we'll talk about in a second, is the same cost. The formula, however, is calculated uniquely for each customer so that if there is extra strength concentration coming into the plant, it's factored into the formula at these rates that you see in the chart for BOD and TSS. I haven't reported COD on this table, but it is a factor in the event that the cost load is greater. We took a look at the revenue that the district collected in 2019 for all customers, just to get an idea of the proportion that's recovered from those different charges and charge components I've been talking about. By far, the greatest amount of revenue recovered is from that usage charge. So that $322 million comes from that rate per MCF. Fixed cost recovery charges are next at about 23.5 million. And then the surcharge revenue, so that higher than the limit amount that's charged, is about 4.5 million. Let's focus a little bit on surcharges. When we are conducting this rate study, and this is not done, by the way, I'm going to remind you that we're still in the middle of it. We are attempting, and our task is to align the costs that the district incurs with the rates, and not just for surcharges, across the board. We're going to talk a little bit about that process and then go to a regional comparison. So the neighborhood, who's charging for industrial surcharges and what are they charging? Our task, and you'll see this in the scope if you request it, our task is to look at not just the current industrial surcharges, but also look at other pollutants. This is part of the rate study. When we ask the question, which pollutants should a surcharge be applied to, we know that currently the BOD and TSS charges are currently assessed. We are also looking at nitrogen and ammonia and phosphorus. So we know that these are, at times, these are constituents that other utilities apply surcharges to. We know that industrial customers are sampled annually and that 5-year averages are used to normalize loadings. So sampling and normalization of loadings is important and an important consideration. But what are the other considerations that the district might have for applying a surcharge to a certain pollutant? One of the requirements is that of a permit limit. So the district will be looking at what pollutants are limited and how much has to be treated and removed before discharging the wastewater stream. The second element are cost drivers. There must be a cost associated and identifiable with that pollutant loading in order to be able to charge for it. So as you saw previously, we're able to assign costs and cost buckets to the different charge parameters, of which BOD and TSS are a big component. So we have to be able to assign cost to these parameters. Everything in wastewater rate making is cost-based. Customers with higher domestic strength need to be identified. Otherwise, there's no surcharge. So that means the pollutant must be measurable and billable. Keeping that in mind, we did a preliminary assessment of the strength coming into the treatment plant, the strength of wastewater flow. We already know that the flow is approximately 240 million gallons per day. Then we wanted to look at those pounds per day of the loadings and of these charge parameters. So using that average of 2018 through 2020, the pounds per day of TSS being treated at the plant, out of that, we determined and calculated the extra loadings. So the loadings above the limits that the district had set, which actually are for TSS, it's 266 milligrams per liter per MCF. So we have 38,000 extra pounds per day coming into the plant. That's about 15% of the total pounds at the plant. That's higher than normal strength. That's driving some of the district's costs. On the BOD side, out of the 124,000 pounds per day treated, almost 35,000 pounds are extra pounds, or greater than the limit of 228 milligrams per liter. So that's 28% of the pounds coming into the plant are extra strength. For phosphorus, that is measured, believe it or not, and monitored. So the 5,000 pounds per day received at the plant, out of that, 286 is estimated to be greater than a limit that's not set because the district does not have that limit for phosphorus. But we assumed it was approximately 7 milligrams per liter. And with that, 5% of the extra loadings, or of the, 5% of the average loading received at the plant would be extra or higher strength. And then finally, ammonia. We did the same calculation with the exception that the ammonia, there's a limit at one of the plants for ammonia, but we assumed that the limit for purposes of calculating extra loadings is 12 milligrams per liter. With that calculation, we estimated that 587 pounds per day would be higher strength, which is, 4% of the amount coming into the plant. So you can see that the bulk of the extra loadings received at the treatment plants for the district is TSS and BOD, but a small component of the extra strength would be for phosphorus and ammonia. In order to determine whether or not another charge parameter is warranted, we also wanted to see what your neighbors were doing. So we looked at the following utilities, and these limits are current for 2020. Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District is at the top, and I mentioned the 228 milligrams per liter as the limit for that load or that concentration for BOD. By the way, for COD, it works out to be 532 milligrams per liter, but for simplicity, I've just reported BOD. TSS is 266 milligrams per liter, and currently there's no nitrogen limit here. For the Louisville Metropolitan Sewerage District in Kentucky, they show 250 milligrams per liter BOD and 270 for TSS. You'll notice that these these limits reflect, they're pretty close, and they reflect the individual characteristics of the utility. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that each utility, each community has unique characteristics and unique costs. So I'm just showing these for comparison purposes. The St. Louis MSD in Missouri has 300 milligrams per liter for both of its limits and no ammonia, no nitrogen. MSD of Cincinnati, MSDGC, is at 240 milligrams per liter for BOD and 300 for TSS. You can read the rest. We have Columbus, Ohio, and Sanitation District Number 1 in Kentucky, or SD1, and then Citizens Energy Group in Indianapolis, Indiana. So there's just a small range of limits here across these sample utilities, pretty close. The difference is that MSDGC, so Cincinnati, Columbus, SD1, and Citizens in Indianapolis have nitrogen limits as well, and they apply a surcharge. SD1 also has a phosphorus limit, but that's it. Let's look at these surcharges they actually assess customers. First graph is for BOD. What we're seeing are the levels of surcharge in milligrams per liter per MCF. So these are dollars per milligrams per liter per MCF. So that's equivalent to how the district assesses these surcharges. Some of these other communities assess them differently, but we've put them on a comparative basis. Cincinnati is at the top for the highest charge for BOD, and the sewer district is at the bottom here. And this rate that we are showing here for the district is for the suburbs. So you can see how the others range. It's pretty close. You know, the average is approximately, and I'm not even going to say how many cents that is because it's small, per milligrams per liter per MCF. Next, we have TSS. So for TSS, it's a little different. The order's different. Cincinnati is still at the top, but the sewer district is next, not too far off from Columbus. And then you see that Citizens is at the lowest for TSS. And again, these surcharges are driven by the characteristics of the wastewater coming into the plant and the treatment processes and costs. We wanted to keep that comparison in mind when we're conducting our study. That's essentially rate making in how many minutes? In about 40 minutes. There are many nuances, as Bill said, to this process. We're in the middle of this process and we continue to look at the values. Our next step is to actually calculate those rate components. So the cost per MCF of flow, the rate per milligram per liter per MCF for BOD and TSS, et cetera. We will come back to you and talk to you about what we're finding in this cost process. It is important that we also incorporate affordability impacts to this assessment because this is a total rate study, not just focused on surcharges. And then we do have some alternative scenarios that the district is looking at in terms of costs. And finally, we're coming to the board probably around March with a set of proposed alternatives, so consideration of rate alternatives. That's all I have, and I think this is a good place to pause for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, and also Bill. So I'm going to take the most current questions based on your most recent topics and then work my way backwards. There's a couple that we have here, several of which you did already address in your presentation, so thank you for that. In your comparison of utilities, a question came in, why is the Toledo Public Utilities loading limits not included, as this entity is similar industrial and city makeup? Is there a specific reason why Toledo is not necessarily listed among this group?
I can answer this. We were looking for the size of the utility, but we can certainly look at Toledo when we're presenting this information.
And a subsequent question is noted. The BOD and TSS surcharges only occur when greater than limits, when greater than the limit. So are the slides accurate as the charge is levied on less wastewater? I
am not sure I understand that question. I apologize.
Okay. Okay, and if Lance, I see that question came from you, if you can follow up on that question, I will try to rephrase it. And Carol, if you can also see the chat, you may also get some clarification there. I'm going to scroll back up to a question that began, I believe it was during Bill's initial presentation. And the question came in, is Stantec considering the large amounts of rationalization of costs that have been required to occur in lots of other industries across the country? And how is this being done? So can you speak at all about cost rationalization across across the industries across the country?
I'm afraid that may be another one where I certainly am, there may be a term of art that I'm just not familiar with. But maybe if we can get a little bit more explanation on what cost rationalization means, then we can respond.
Very good. So we may also be able to get that. So there was the follow-up. Lance did follow up. Carol, if you can advance to the next slide, which refers to the unit cost. This may be the slide that Lance was asking about. BOD and total suspended solid surcharges only occur when greater than the limit. So he's just wondering whether these slides fully and accurately represent, since the charge is levied on less wastewater.
I will try to answer that with a few points.
Thank you.
The data that I found was on each of the communities' websites and their rate schedules. So they are current as of today, so it's 2020. They report their surcharges. And I am assuming that they did a rate study as well to come up with those unit costs. And there's something I need to mention too, is that these unit rates that we calculate are not just for extra strength. They're actually based on all flow coming into the plant, all milligrams per liter per MCF. It's not just the extra part, so that we take the total pounds of loading or total constituents coming into the plant divided by total costs allocated to that divided by the total amount coming into the plant. So whatever flow changes occur, it's reflected in that concentration. So the milligrams per liter per MCF. So it gets reflected in the unit cost calculation. We have lower flows, you'll likely see higher unit rates. I'm not sure if that's where the question was headed.
I think this might help.
Yeah, Bill, go ahead.
If I could, John. It's true that the trigger conditions are different. The limits are different place to place. So these rates then get applied either sooner or later, depending upon the lower or higher trigger level. So if it's 260 milligrams per liter, that trigger would happen sooner than the 300 milligrams per liter in a different place. So these aren't really an attempt to make a comparable typical bill, because then you'd have to assume a strength and a volumetric rate and all that. But I think that's what the question is alluding to.
Okay.
It's true.
Thank you.
Very good. If there are any other questions from the audience, I'll take another moment to give you a chance to enter those in the chat. Following today's presentation, we are recording, as was noted in the beginning. We will make this recording available on our YouTube page, and we'll share that and make it available to guests who may not have been able to attend today. So thank you for that. No other questions coming in at this time, Carol, Frank, and so I just wanted to make sure that you are brought up to speed. And so we are done with the questions that have come in so far. So thank you for that.
I think we're good if there are no more questions. I want to stress that again, we do want to be engaged. So if we have not fully answered certain questions, we'd like to better understand them, and we can have a dialogue in that regard.
So that does conclude today's presentation. I appreciate the engagement and the questions that we have received thus far. If you have any further questions, you can respond to the email that was sent to you for this invitation. We'll certainly take those questions and add them to our discussion moving forward. Frank or Carol or Bill or Scott, any closing comments for this morning?
Well, I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank everyone for the questions. These are good questions. And we want to continue to have a dialogue. So I want to thank everyone for your participation.
Thank you very much. So our panelists, if we can stay logged on here for a moment, we will wrap up our side of the conversation here. For those of you who are attending, thank you very much. We will be ending our broadcast here at this time. And if you have further questions, again, you can respond to that email, and we will make this recording available on our YouTube page in the near future. Thank you very much for your time.
You still on, John?
Yeah, we're still, some of our attendees are still dropping off. So if we can just hang tight, if our panelists can stay here, I will
Okay.
have you muted and we will be ending here shortly. Thank you.